Mr. Hanson, have you been to China?
No.
No. You're not a historian on China.
Have you been to Greece?
No. We're not talking about Greece.
No,
we're talking about
no, we're
Mao.
talking about Western civilization. I'm talking about Western
No. I'm talking about
civilization.
Mao. I'm talking about Mao. I
Well,
don't
we're
think you
talking
have the
about both.
legitimacy. I don't think you have the qualification to talk about the Mao and China.
I don't
Because
think
you're
I
not
would
a
be given a
historian on
visa.
China, and then you
Yeah, I don't
don't
think I'd
have
be
been
given
to
a visa.
have not been to China.
Have
So
you been to the
now,
moon, or have you
having
been to
said
the
that,
moon? Can you talk about
having said
astronomy
that,
if you haven't been to the moon? You're absurd.
I mean,
You're
you're not
absurd.
talking.
Hasan Piker has a word for what happened under Mao Zedong. Excesses. Not genocide, not catastrophe. Excesses. Right before he calls Mao one of the great leaders who changed the entire planet. That word choice is the whole fight in miniature. Because when Victor Davis Hanson pushes back with an actual number, the response he gets isn't a better number. It's questions about whether he's even qualified to talk about China at all. Accusations of bias. Accusations of propaganda. So, here's what this episode is really asking. When someone tries to shrink one of history's deadliest regimes down to a euphemism, and the pushback gets met with deflection instead of a real answer, does the deflection work? And does that same pattern of minimizing the ugly stuff show up in how we treat the political heirs of that ideology today? Before we get into it, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. Here we break down the biggest political and cultural stories from around the world, challenge the narratives dominating the headlines, and give you a perspective you won't get from the mainstream media. Let's get into it.
Mao Zedong is one of the great leaders of this world, okay? A man who changed the entire universe, the entire planet. Okay? For real, yes. I mean, there was a lot of fucking excesses, let's be real, but the People's Republic of China would not exist without Mao Zedong.
Excesses. That's the word Hasan Piker uses to describe what happened under Mao Zedong, right before calling him one of the great leaders who changed the entire planet. Piker's argument rests on a simple trade. Mao founded the People's Republic of China, and that founding is treated as enough to earn him greatness, with everything else filed under an oddly gentle label. But founding a state doesn't erase what building it cost. If the number of dead is high enough, calling it an excess isn't a factual claim anymore. It's a euphemism doing the work that facts can't. That's the standard being set up here, and it's worth remembering as we get into what actually happened.
In the Black Book of Communism listed him as the greatest mass murderer in history. 60 to 70 million people he either had executed or starved.
Victor Davis Hanson doesn't let that word sit unchallenged. He cites the Black Book of Communism, the landmark study of communist regimes, putting the number at 60 to 70 million dead under Mao, either executed or starved. That figure isn't invented. The book really does put its estimate at around 65 million, so Hanson is citing something real and well documented. Here's the part that matters for how confident we should be. That number sits at the high end of a much wider range historians have produced, some running as low as 15 million, depending on what you count and how you count it. So, the claim isn't wrong, exactly. It's the aggressive end of a genuinely contested scholarly range. That distinction is going to matter a lot as this argument continues.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not. Look, let me tell you this, okay? The great leap forward you are talking about from 1958 to 1961 was a failure. There was a famine. I myself admit that in my writings, in my talk, okay? But exactly number of the famine toll is still very controversial. There's no exact figure. If you are anti-communist, anti-China, you like to have the as highest number as possible. If you are sympathetic with, well, let me finish, because you haven't been talking for so long. I don't know how to make sense of you anyway. Let me finish. If you are sympathetic with the Chinese people, with the Chinese Revolution, then you don't agree with that number. For instance, like, okay, one estimate of the famine toll is linear estimated. So they take the death rate and the birth rate of 1957, and then they say in 1962, after the Great Leap Forward, China should have such and such and such a population. But that, it is very possible, I mean, it's highly likely, the so-called people who died of starvation were not even born. Because during famine, people, when the people are hungry, you don't have babies as many as usually do.
All right, let me bring...
Mobo Gao doesn't deny the famine happened. He's clear about that. What he challenges is the method behind the biggest numbers, arguing that simple population extrapolation can't tell the difference between people who died and people who were simply never born because a starving population stops having children. That's not just a talking point. It's a real critique that shows up in the demographic literature on this period. But here's where it runs into trouble. The more rigorous, peer-reviewed reconstructions of the famine already separate births from deaths, and they still land somewhere between 15 and 45 million excess deaths. So, Gao's methodology critique is legitimate against the crudest, highest estimates. It doesn't touch the middle of the actual academic consensus. His separate claim that estimates are mostly driven by political sympathy is something nobody can actually prove either way.
I have actually studied Mao. I studied it when I was at school. So I'm very cognizant of what Mao did. And your attempt to paper over the monstrosities of Mao is pretty shameful, actually. The idea that somehow all these numbers are wrong and it was massively over-exaggerated and he wasn't such a bad guy. And, you know, it's all bullshit.
Anti-communist propaganda.
Anyway,
it's all anti-communist propaganda. And you are brainwashed.
Yeah, I'm not... Listen, I'm not brainwashed, but I'm not a massive fan of communism.
Hanson doesn't engage with that methodological point. Instead, he calls disputing the numbers shameful and, along with Piers Morgan, suggests Gao's position is communist propaganda, even brainwashing. Gao pushes back, saying he's no fan of communism. Look at what Gao actually said just a moment earlier. He conceded that the famine was real and a policy failure. His argument was about the size of the number, not whether people died. Collapsing that distinction into propaganda is a rhetorical shortcut, not a rebuttal. It also doesn't hold up against the fact that skepticism about the highest death toll estimates shows up in published scholarship independent of this debate, whatever you think of that scholarship's politics. Disputing a number and denying an atrocity are two different things, and treating them as the same thing lets you win an argument without actually answering it.
Thank you for having me. Yes, perhaps first of all, I might ask Mr. Hanson, have you been to China?
No.
No. You're not a historian.
Have you been to Greece?
No. We're not talking about Greece.
No,
we're talking about
we're talking about Western civilization. I'm talking about Western civilization.
I'm talking about Mao. I'm talking about Mao. I don't think you have the legitimacy. I don't think you have the qualification to talk about the Mao and China.
I don't
because
think
you're
I
not
would
a
be given
historian
a
on
visa.
China, and then you
I
don't
think I'd
have
be given a visa.
not been to China.
Have you
So
been to
now,
the moon, or have you
having
been
said
to the
that,
moon? Can you talk about
having said
astronomy
that-
if you haven't been to the moon? You're absurd.
I mean, you're not
Gao
talking.
changes the subject here. Instead of addressing the number, he goes after Hanson directly, arguing that he's not qualified to talk about Mao because he's never set foot in China and isn't a China historian by trade. Notice what that standard implies. If you need first-hand residency to comment credibly on a country's history, most of what gets written about any nation by anyone who didn't personally live through it would have to be thrown out. That's a much higher bar than anyone actually applies, consistently, including probably to arguments Gao himself would want taken seriously about places he hasn't lived.
Have you been to the moon, or have you been to the moon? Can you talk about
Having said
astronomy
that,
if you haven't been to the moon? You're absurd.
I mean,
You're an
you're not
absurd.
Hanson's answer is blunt. He compares it to needing to have been to the moon before you're allowed to discuss it. That lands because it exposes the real problem with Gao's standard. Historical knowledge comes from documents, records, and scholarship, not personal residency. Nobody demands that a Holocaust historian be German, or that a Roman historian have visited ancient Rome. The analogy holds because the underlying principle that expertise requires first-hand presence was never true to begin with.
I think that's a very good point. Look, sadly, we have to wrap this. It's a fascinating conversation, but I do think that Victor raises a very good point, which is you don't have to go to the moon to comment about the moon landings or about lunar exploration. I think the argument, when people say, well, you haven't been there, you can't talk about it, it doesn't mean you can't study history and understand the brutality of Mao or how many millions of Chinese peasants in particular suffered and died on his watch. It makes him statistically the biggest monster of modern times, and that includes Hitler and Stalin and others. But anyway,
Piers Morgan takes that same logic and runs further with it. If you don't need to visit the moon to study it, you don't need to have lived in China to understand what Mao did to it. Fair enough, that follows. Then he goes a step further, calling Mao statistically the biggest monster of modern times, ahead of Hitler and Stalin, based on the sheer number of peasants who died. That comparison isn't fringe. Several well-known death toll compilations do put Mao-era deaths above commonly cited totals for both regimes. But ranking regimes this way means treating deaths from policy failure and famine the same as deliberate extermination. And plenty of historians think that comparison collapses meaningful differences in intent and mechanism. So, the underlying numbers are real. The ranking built on top of them is one interpretation among historians who work this way, not a settled verdict.
Have you told the Chinese government that? Have you written that and told the Chinese government that when you're living in China?
Well, of course.
Well,
You have never read my works, have you?
Are you living now in China?
No, I'm not. I go back to China.
No, why is that?
Often.
Why is that? Why is that?
Because my family is here.
Because if you were to go to China and you would write a long critique of the Chinese Communist Party and
I don't talk about
free elections,
I talk about it.
I don't think you would be watched. You would be surveilled. You say you know so much about China and you're deliberately trying to masquerade what you know about.
Hanson flips the qualification standard right back around. Gao doesn't live in China either, he points out, and if he went back and wrote a real critique of the Communist Party, he'd likely be surveilled for it. The implication is that Gao is holding something back. It's true that China does surveil and restrict critics. That part checks out. What doesn't check out is the leap from that general fact to a specific claim about what Gao personally believes but won't say. There's no evidence offered that Gao is self-censoring anything. That's not a fact about Gao. It's a guess about his motives dressed up as an argument.
And your position,
that's okay.
your position, your stand dictates your point of view of China. And you take, because of that, you would accept anything that is bad about China. You wouldn't accept things that is good
Gao's
about
response is to call Hanson biased outright, saying he'll accept anything negative about China and nothing positive. That might be true of some critics somewhere, but notice that it's asserted, not shown. Nothing in Gao's response points to a positive claim about China that Hanson specifically rejected. An accusation of bias isn't the same as demonstrating it.
Hang on. I went to China. Unlike Victor, I have been to China. I went and spent 3 weeks in Shanghai about 12, 13 years ago. I did a documentary about Shanghai, and I found it to be an extremely dynamic and interesting place. I don't intrinsically have a hatred of all things Chinese. I can appreciate how successful China's been in many different ways. And I met a lot of Chinese people whose company I thoroughly enjoyed. So I'm not anti-Chinese. But when you try and attempt to downplay the enormity of Mao's crimes and the appalling impact he had on tens of millions of particularly Chinese peasants, I'm afraid you
Piers Morgan answers that one directly. And it's a fair answer. He's been to Shanghai, made a documentary there, liked the people he met, and says none of that changes his view of Mao. That distinction actually holds up. You can appreciate a country and its people while still refusing to minimize what its government or a past leader actually did. Those aren't intention. Treating them as if they are is exactly the move that's let this debate drift away from the death toll and into character assassination.
The prosperity came. We've come a long way, Piers. If you remember, during the Obama administration, Anita Dunn was the communications director, and she said at one point that her hero in history was Mao Zedong. And the outcry, not just from the conservative side, but from the Democratic side, was such she had to resign and step down. But that same party now will have a unabashed admirer of Mao.
Hanson pivots the episode towards something closer to home. He points to Anita Dunn, Obama's communications director, who once called Mao one of her favorite political philosophers and, in his telling, paid for it with her job. The quote is real. Dunn did say that in 2009, and it did cause a stir. Where the comparison gets shaky is the resignation part. Reporting from that time describes her role as an interim position she'd accepted from the start. And White House officials said her departure had nothing to do with the controversy. So the underlying double standard argument needs a cleaner example than this one. The comment happened. Whether it actually cost her the job is a lot less certain than the story suggests.
Campaign and the people, I think it's a fair thing to say if you were a major candidate in a blue state and you had to pick between Hasan Piker and Chuck Schumer, the majority probably would pick Hasan Piker, even though he said things like, you know, 9/11 was justified. And he said a lot of things that I would interpret as abjectly anti-Semitic. He said he didn't think anybody who supported Israel could be or should be president, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody, the media also...
Then there's Hasan Piker himself, the same figure this episode opened with. Hanson argues Piker would beat Chuck Schumer in a blue state primary despite saying things like, America deserved 9/11, a comment Piker later admitted was inappropriate. That part checks out. So does the broader pattern Hanson is pointing at. Advocacy groups and some Democratic officials have specifically called out remarks from Piker as anti-Semitic, including comments minimizing sexual violence during the October 7th attacks. Though Piker frames his own comments as anti-Zionist rather than anti-Semitic, and that's a real dispute, not a settled one. Here's where the argument overreaches. Hanson says this has gone largely uncovered by the media. It hasn't. There's been substantial coverage, including from outlets forcing Democrats who've appeared with him to answer for it. The tolerance for this kind of rhetoric may well be real. But claiming silence around it when the record shows the opposite undercuts the point instead of strengthening it.
Well, just very quickly, the media really hasn't discussed the history of socialist revolutions, the 1848 revolution, earlier, the Jacobin Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. The people who organized those had minority support, and they were from the upper middle and even wealthy classes. And that's exactly what we're seeing today, that we have a lot of big donors. We have Mamdani, who was, as I said, the 1%, his parents were PhDs. And we have Khanna now thinks he's a neo-socialist. He's worth $200 million. His wife drives a Range Rover. I mentioned Hasan Piker. So this is a top-down elite group of people, and I don't think they're going to have any resonance when they get out and outside of their enclaves. But we'll see. Depends a lot about how the Republicans handle it, and we'll see.
Hanson closes with a bigger historical claim, that socialist movements from 1848 through the Bolsheviks were always led by people from wealthy backgrounds, and that today's version is Zohran Mamdani and Khanna. Some of that holds up. Mamdani's father does have a Harvard PhD, but his mother isn't a PhD either. She's a filmmaker with a reported net worth nowhere near the picture being painted. And the specific numbers attached to Khanna, a $200 million net worth, his wife's Range Rover, don't show up anywhere in the available record. That doesn't mean they're false. It means they're unconfirmed. And unconfirmed specifics shouldn't be doing the work of proving a pattern. The broader historical point that elite backgrounds show up again and again in movements claiming to speak for the working class is worth taking seriously on its own. It just needs to stand on evidence that actually holds up, not on numbers nobody can verify. So, where does this actually land? Start with the number. Excesses was never a factual claim. It was a softer word standing in for tens of millions of deaths. Hanson's 60 to 70 million figure is real. It's in the Black Book of Communism, but it's the high end of a wide range, and that matters. Mobogao's methodology critique deserves credit too. Raw population extrapolation really can overstate the death toll. But even the rigorous, peer-reviewed reconstructions that fix that problem still land between 15 and 45 million excess deaths. So Gao's point narrows the number. It doesn't erase the catastrophe. And that's really the story of this whole debate. Every time the death toll got harder to argue with, the fight moved somewhere else. Away from methodology and onto Hanson's passport. He's never lived in China, so apparently he can't have an opinion, a standard nobody actually applies to history anywhere else. Away from the numbers and onto accusations of bias and propaganda that never got demonstrated, just asserted. Calling a narrow, evidence-based methodological objection shameful and brainwashing doesn't refute it. It dodges it. And accusing Hanson of only accepting bad news about China doesn't work either, because nobody pointed to a single positive claim he actually rejected. Strip away the deflections, and what's left is this. The famine happened. The death toll is genuinely enormous by any serious estimate, and disputing the exact size of that number is not the same thing as denying it happened, even though this debate kept treating it that way. That pattern doesn't stay in the past. Anita Dunn really did call Mao one of her favorite philosophers, and Hasan Piker really has said things about 9/11 and October 7th that plenty of people, including some on the left, have called out directly. Not silently, not uncovered, but out loud. Which makes the nobodies talking about this claim the weakest part of that argument. Where the case gets thinner is the specifics. The exact net worth figures attached to Khanna don't hold up under scrutiny, and Mamdani's family background is more mixed than the tidy story suggests. Unverified numbers don't help a real pattern. They just give critics an easy way to dismiss it. So, here's the verdict. Mao's death toll is not a matter of excesses by any honest reading of the evidence, contested range or not. And when that reality gets challenged, the challenge lands harder on the messenger than on the message. Credentialism instead of counter-evidence. Accusations instead of arguments. That's the same move showing up again in how today's politics handles the people who still hold Mao up as an inspiration. The specifics don't all check out. The pattern does. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe.